for reasons you'll see momentarily, but I will just quickly go through how they were founded, who they were, what happened. There were about, I think, 7 kids in actually a St. Charles Reformatory School, so they didn't actually start, like, as a neighborhood club, unlike most of the gangs. And they met in a reformatory, formed a club there for protection, because, surprise, reformatory is a pretty rough place. They got out, they stuck together, and they sort of began to accrete into an ordinary gang. And gangs mostly battled each other, in part just for the great glory of their manliness, and in part because they had nothing to do, and like there was no recreation where they lived. They were just bored out of their mind, angry, standing on street corners, that kind of thing. And also, every single recreational facility that did exist was controlled by a gang. A gang would control the school you went to, the movie theater in your neighborhood, even the houses where, like, the girls lived. They would fight over, like, who had the most girls in their territory. Basically. Yeah, I know. It was pretty bad. So, if you wanted to do anything, basically, at all, you needed a gang. And so the Vice Lords were an incredibly successful gang. They just did really well. I won't go through, like, every nitty-gritty detail of the great battle of, you know, this street or whatever, but they took on most of the big gangs in their area. They absorbed most of them, and they sort of made, eventually, like, once they had most of the West Side, made peace treaties with the other big ones. Calm down, son. By this point, the people who had started it when they were like 15 were now 20, maybe? They'd gotten older. Like, they thought they were old anyway. And they had a sort of new generation of kids. And kids would start in gangs as young as 10 sometimes. Like, they wouldn't be out, like, necessarily in all of the great rumbles, but, like, really everyone was in the gangs. And the gangs were incredibly young. Like, it's hard to understand exactly how young they actually were. And at one point, I don't recall the exact date, but it was after Daley had been mayor of Chicago for quite a bit, the first Daley. The younger gang members came to the older ones saying that they wanted to, you know, go roll on someone. And the other gang members had the usual response of, like, well, did someone disrespect you? Did something happen? You know, like, okay, sure, what? And the kids basically had a, like, you know, you've all made your reputations already, we want to make ours. Let's go beat some people up. And the way they describe it is sort of, they spent a while talking to the kids about their youth when they were doing this kind of thing. And they sort of had a moment of, like, they sort of had one of those moments of waking up. They were like, do you, like, oh my god, we've done nothing with our lives, we have no education, we don't have jobs, you know, and, like, is this really what you're looking for? Like, we've seen people get hurt. At this point, guns weren't very common. There were some killings, but there weren't many. Mostly they fought with, like, chains, bats, fists, that kind of thing. And they were basically trying to discourage the kids from doing it, and when they told the kids not to, the kids were like, well, what else are we going to do? We can't get a job, we can't go to school. Like, there's just not much going on. And it was right around then that David Dolly, the guy who wrote that book, came into things. He originally came out to Chicago for, like, Trans-American Corporation or something like that. He was doing a survey on, like, urban poverty. He used to work in the Peace Corps. He was, you know, community organizer, white liberal of the 60s, that kind of thing. And he got there and was really moved by them, got very attached to them, and they got to like him because he actually went down into their neighborhood alone and wasn't, like, afraid to be there at night, and just generally was a very scary man. He was a black belt in Taekwondo and, like, was just completely insane and should have gotten in so much trouble, but they liked him, so he didn't. And he left back to go give his report, but he promised he'd come back. And he actually did, which impressed them a lot. And he basically quit to work full-time for the Vice Lords. What he did with them, actually, was incorporate them. They became a company. And what they did is they began writing grant applications.
Were gangs based around drug distribution like they are now a lot more, or were
Not
they really
at all.
much less?
That's actually the very interesting thing about the gangs. The gangs, there were no drugs in Chicago
So it
at
wasn't
the
like
time.
you can go out and sell drugs if you don't want to kill people.
Nope. There was no money, actually, being in a gang. That was the really big change in crime in Chicago from the policy kings to the gangsters, is the gangs most emphatically could not make money at all. In fact, they once tried to get in on the whole protection thing, mob style, you know, like, pay us not to break your window. And when they did this, the mob, like, basically destroyed them. They came in with shotguns and killed half their leaders and said, you ever try this again, we will kill all of you. So they made no money doing anything. They just beat each other up.
Gotcha. So it was for fun. sense.
Sort of. It was for fun, and honestly, it was to live. Like it's sort of like they were the ones creating conditions to some extent, but like once they'd been created, no individual person could really like you would really get killed if you didn't join a gang, or at least you would be unable to like leave your house.
Gotcha.
Until you were like in your 30s, when you could leave. Like a lot of them sort of drifted out of the gang when they were in their 30s and tried to get jobs. It didn't really work out that well, but like it was sort of it was very awkward and halfway. They didn't really have much of a purpose at all. Until Dolly came along. Well, and it wasn't just him. Like they had decided what they wanted to do. It was sort of an effort together, but he sort of brought the like I am a Harvard-educated person who knows how to, like, talk to, like, Sears Roebuck about this. And they needed his help, and they got the support of a lot of the really big businesses in Chicago. Like, I don't remember all of the companies they worked with. Sears was, I think, one of them, but they got this project called Project Bootstrap going, where they wrote a bunch of grants, they got awarded a lot of them, and they opened up a bunch of businesses on the west side, which was mostly full of burnt-out shells, of buildings at this point. And they started 2, like, Tasty Freeze franchises, like ice cream stores, and, like, this thing called, like, Teen Town, like a sort of restaurant, recreational place. They started an arts center, like teaching kids to draw, and a clothing store, like an African heritage clothing store, and a bunch of other stuff. And they also kept the West Side from rioting during the 60s for a while. Like, they spent, I don't even remember the exact summer, I think it was 66 or 67, basically out on the streets talking to the gang saying, if you start any trouble, if you riot, if you fight, we will basically come down on you with the wrath of God. And they were at this point one of the biggest gangs in Chicago, certainly on the West Side. So people listened, and the West Side they had what they call like a cool summer, which was very impressive for the time period. Like people were rioting constantly and fighting constantly, and basically they turned into a police force in their neighborhood since the police didn't police their neighborhood. They went through all of this, and it was right around 1960, like, I guess it was 68 that, oh no, sorry, it was 67 that Martin Luther King came to Chicago. Now, I don't know how many people know the history of Martin Luther King's experiences in Chicago. They're not as publicized as most of the stuff he did, with reason. But Chicago was a disaster, really, for his organization. Daley is a canny mayor. And basically, Martin Luther King, he came, he got a huge march together. He reached out to the gangs and to the Black Panthers, to the sort of what we think of as the extreme fringe groups of the civil rights movement. And he began to try and broker deals with them. None of them liked the whole nonviolence thing. They felt like they'd been pushed around enough, and they were angry, damn it, and they didn't want to sort of, like, just sit down and let people hurt them. But they were at least impressed with what King had done enough to think about it, Like, they were glad that he sort of respected how much he needed them and that he was reaching out to them, and that was enough that they sort of began to pull together into a coalition. The Black Panthers in Chicago at this time were being led by someone named Fred Hampton, who was 20, our age, and who was very impressively intelligent and was really taking them in a very interesting direction. They were again, whole other lecture on what he was doing. But so there was a very interesting and impressive coalition coming about, and they had a big march. But Daley's response was to King's sort of like the housing conditions here are atrocious, and like people are living in slums, and like it's terrible. Daley's response was, okay, but I don't know how to fix it. Do you have any suggestions on how to fix it? And obviously that's not an easy question, because at this point the infrastructure is rotten, you can't force rich people to move back. Like, it's very difficult to do, and the King's organization really ran into a brick wall. They had a housing summit meeting where Daley basically said,